The Vietnam War is often perceived as a conflict where American forces fought solely alongside their South Vietnamese allies, without outside help. However, the reality is that over 40 countries offered various forms of support to the Republic of Vietnam in its battle against communism. 5 nations directly assisted the United States with military support: the Republic of Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. Among these, 4 provided combat troops to fight alongside American and South Vietnamese soldiers, while the Philippines sent a military civic action battalion to aid South Vietnamese forces in Tay Ninh province. This paper aims to delve into the events that led to the involvement of what became known as the Free World Military Forces in Vietnam. To grasp why and how these nations joined the Free World Military Forces in Vietnam, it's essential to understand the roots of America's presence in Southeast Asia. The U.S. initially got involved in Vietnam by backing French forces against the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War. Following the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and their subsequent withdrawal from Indochina, the United States took on the challenge. The first U.S. advisory troops arrived in Vietnam in 1954, and American involvement steadily increased until 1965, when the first combat troops were deployed to South Vietnam. From the very beginning of American engagement in Southeast Asia, U.S. policymakers operated on certain assumptions regarding the conflict in Vietnam. Just as the Korean War was seen as a struggle against North Korean and Chinese communist aggression, U.S. leaders viewed the Vietnam War as another chance to confront communist threats. In Korea, the U.S. had rallied allies to join the fight against communism, strengthening the coalition against it and adding credibility to the American efforts. Retired Lieutenant Gen. Stanley R. Larson remarked after the war that it was not surprising that in the early 60s, as the framework of U.S. commitment to Vietnam was being established, the concept of multilateral support was being considered. This notion can be traced back to a memorandum dated November 11, 1961, addressed to President John F. Kennedy from Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, which highlighted the necessity for multilateral action. Rusk and McNamara stated, from a political standpoint, both at home and abroad, it seems crucial to involve forces from other nations alongside U.S. troops in Vietnam. Our position would be significantly bolstered if we could frame the deployment of these forces as a SEATO action, with contributions from other SEATO nations. They believed that international involvement would help reduce accusations of American imperialism in Southeast Asia and foster a consensus similar to that enjoyed by United Nations forces during the Korean War. However, these early ideas did not materialize at that time. President Kennedy was primarily focused on Laos, as the security situation in Vietnam didn't appear critical yet. Yet by late 1963, the Laos issue had been at least tentatively resolved by the 1962 Geneva Accords, while the situation in South Vietnam had grown increasingly precarious, particularly following the assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem in a coup in early November. Shortly after Diem's death, President Kennedy was also assassinated. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was left to confront the escalating crisis in Vietnam. Unsurprisingly, he too recognized the need for international support to lend credibility to American efforts in Southeast Asia. In the spring of 1964, Johnson made an international appeal for free nations to step forward and assist South Vietnam in its battle against communism. The president was convinced that if it could be shown that free world allies were uniting in Vietnam against communist forces, it might mitigate the inevitable accusations of American imperialism. In a news conference on April 23, 1964, Johnson openly proposed this idea, indicating that while he expected the United States to increase military aid to Saigon, he also hoped to see other flags present from different nations. He emphasized the desire for unified action to halt the spread of communism in that region and to protect freedom. Some historians have argued that the More Flags program was primarily conceived by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. However, there is little doubt that Johnson, recognizing the significance of consensus and coalition building, embraced Rusk's approach as he sought international support. the priority would continue until Johnson's departure from office. Just a week after the president's remarks at the press conference, the More Flags initiative was officially launched on May 1, 1964. In a cable from Secretary of State Rusk to all U.S. embassies globally. The message declared, "The United States government has decided to call upon other nations of the free world to show their support through political and material contributions to the Vietnamese government." Several countries were already offering technical assistance, development funding, and humanitarian aid. However, Rusk urged American ambassadors to encourage their host nations to either increase their support or commit if they hadn't contributed yet. Rusk emphasized, "The nature and extent of the contributions sought are not as significant right now as the fact that they are being made." Although it wasn't explicitly stated, the underlying goal was to gather as many flags as possible to illustrate international support for the South Vietnamese government and for U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. The crucial aspect was for allied nations to provide any form of aid to South Vietnam, as that would inherently demonstrate their backing of the U.S. position there. Therefore, the push for assistance for South Vietnam in its fight against communism would also bolster the legitimacy of U.S. involvement and serve as proof of international endorsement of America's Vietnam policy. The initial effort to seek aid for the South Vietnamese focused on the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. SEATO had functioned as a platform for the United States to align itself with the South Vietnamese government and to attract potential allies for the war effort. Its members included the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Republic of the Philippines, Pakistan, and the United States. This was a varied coalition where many members shared little in common beyond a mutual fear of communism. Vietnam held a protocol state status within the treaty, much like Laos and Cambodia, receiving protection through a related protocol. However, the varied composition of SEATO and the individual interpretations of the communist threat among its members made it nearly impossible for them to take unified action. The flags of SEATO were not symbols of war. The appeal rooted in the SEATO Treaty didn't guarantee a response from its member nations. Many chose not to engage actively with the U.S. due to issues within their own countries. Research indicates that the reluctance of most SEATO nations to answer the U.S.'s call for more flags implies they didn't view the status of South Vietnam as worth the political or military risks of sending combat troops. In a memo from May 25, 1964, McGeorge Bundy, who served as the Presidential Assistant for National Security Affairs, suggested convening a high-level conference to discuss specific support commitments from SEATO allies. However, this conference never happened, marking the end of efforts to rally support under SEATO's banner. Ultimately, the treaty proved flawed, and the organization fell short of effectiveness, resulting in a lack of requested support from most member countries. While the U.S. aimed to encourage other nations to join the Vietnam effort under the guise of SEATO, it was, as one of President Johnson's advisors later put it, a very shaky vehicle indeed. Rusk's early call for more flags didn't yield significant outcomes. In a July 2, 1964 circular telegram to U.S. ambassadors worldwide, a clearly frustrated Johnson expressed, "I am gravely disappointed by the lack of action from our friends and allies in response to our request for them to share the burden of free world responsibility in Vietnam. It's been 9 weeks since the Secretary of State urged your embassy to seek assistance from your accredited government. While their verbal responses have shown sympathy, the actual actions do not reflect their acknowledgement of this responsibility or the weight we place on having them uphold it." He went on, "I am assigning you the personal duty of ensuring that the government you represent understands how seriously we regard the challenge to freedom in Vietnam and the significant burden that falls on nations that enjoy freedom themselves to defend it." He concluded with heartfelt seriousness, "I look forward to seeing signs of your success soon." In response, U.S. ambassadors across Europe, Asia, and Latin America intensified their efforts to encourage countries to contribute development funds, medical and engineering assistance, and food for South Vietnam. Initially, the focus wasn't on securing foreign combat troops, although that would shift later on. Typically, American embassies would seek assistance from host countries based on a list of needs provided by Headquarters Military Assistance Command Vietnam. When a country agreed to help, the U.S. government would notify South Vietnam, which would then formally request aid from that nation. However, despite these diplomatic efforts, only 15 countries answered the initial American appeal. Of those, only 6 offered significant support: South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and nationalist China. And most of this assistance was non-military. The More Flags initiative clearly fell short of Johnson's expectations. On December 1, 1964, Johnson brought together his closest advisors at the White House to discuss the best way to meet U.S. objectives in Vietnam. They reached a consensus on the need to stop North Vietnam's backing of Viet Cong activities in the South, to restore a secure and independent South Vietnam, and to safeguard other non-communist nations in Southeast Asia. These goals indicated an increase in U.S. involvement in the conflict, which also meant ramping up efforts to gain international backing for South Vietnam and U.S. strategies in the region. During the meeting, the president emphasized the importance of securing assistance for the GVN and for our efforts on its behalf from our allies. He expressed dissatisfaction with the More Flags program and tasked his advisors with creating a new approach to boost international involvement. In later discussions, the decision was made to forgo invoking SEATO, opting instead to seek international assistance for South Vietnam strictly through bilateral agreements with key allies, including Great Britain, Thailand, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Thailand agreed to offer military support to South Vietnam and ramp up its own counterinsurgency efforts. British Prime Minister J. Harold Wilson was briefed about the situation and sought support. William P. Bundy from the State Department reached out to Australia and New Zealand regarding the possible deployment of small combat units if the United States transitioned to the next phase of its strategy, which involved increasing military pressure against the communists. The Philippines were approached for a commitment of around 1,800 troops. The meeting concluded with a consensus to explore all potential options for increased external aid. This gathering and the agreements made represented a pivotal moment in the More Flags program. From then on, the focus shifted from primarily securing humanitarian and economic assistance to acquiring military aid and eventually combat troops to fight alongside South Vietnamese and American soldiers. Understanding that convincing other countries to send combat forces to South Vietnam would be a tough sell, Johnson recognized the need to make the offer more appealing to nations that might otherwise hesitate to get involved. On December 15, 1964, he instructed the State Department to inform allies that the United States would cover the entire cost of any military aid commitments to South Vietnam. As Robert Blackburn noted, if Lyndon Johnson couldn't persuade other nations to align with America's Vietnam policy through ideological arguments or diplomatic pressure, he would now try to entice them with financial incentives. Nevertheless, there was little immediate reaction from most of America's allies. Only the Philippines, Korea, and the nationalist Chinese governments, which were already providing non-military aid, communicated through diplomatic channels that they might contemplate offering military support to South Vietnam. Thus, the attempt to secure support through financial means failed to achieve the intended outcome. No new countries stepped forward to assist. It's important to highlight that the push to gain allies for South Vietnam was an American initiative from the outset. While President Johnson actively sought external support to aid in the war effort, the South Vietnamese government remained notably indifferent to the entire situation. During a meeting in Washington, the Secretary of State emphasized to the visiting Vietnamese foreign minister the critical need for his government to actively seek assistance from other nations. Chester Cooper, who once directed Asian affairs for the White House, noted that the U.S. efforts to garner support had a slow beginning in late 1964. This was due, in part, to significant pressure being needed for Washington to secure any substantial commitments from other countries. Additionally, the Saigon government was too mired in its own internal political issues to show much enthusiasm. Cooper also pointed out that Saigon seemed to view the initiative as merely a public relations effort aimed at the American audience. The South Vietnamese perspective on this issue can be traced to their cultural and historical context. For centuries, the Vietnamese have fought against foreign invaders who sought to impose their own identity upon the diverse groups in the Indochina region. As a result, many South Vietnamese were not keen on allowing more foreign troops into their territory. From the onset of the More Flags program, requests for aid were primarily initiated by Washington rather than Saigon, which mostly followed Washington's lead. Consequently, Cooper observed that this put Washington in a position of seeking support rather than confidently requesting it. Despite Saigon's hesitance, the American push for international backing intensified as the United States escalated its involvement in the war in 1965. It became increasingly essential to frame the conflict not just as an American endeavor, but as a collective effort of free nations standing against communism. In light of this, the Johnson administration continued to urge its overseas missions to act on behalf of the Many Flags campaign. To reinforce this directive, Secretary of State Rusk sent a cable to all U.S. embassies in January, reiterating the president's strong commitment to securing widespread international support for South Vietnam. As a Marine Expeditionary Brigade made its way to Da Nang, discussions intensified about bringing in combat troops from other nations. By late February 1965, the Joint Chiefs put forward the idea of deploying a division from the Republic of Korea for counterinsurgency and base security efforts. They recognized two key factors that would apply to all Allied forces in South Vietnam: the logistics of supporting the troops and the command and control arrangements. With the 1st U.S. Marine Battalion en route to Da Nang, the State Department sought Ambassador Maxwell Taylor's opinion on whether forming an international combat force in South Vietnam was a wise decision. Taylor had previously expressed concerns about sending Marines to Da Nang, fearing it might encourage the Vietnamese government to offload more responsibilities onto the U.S. He was also hesitant about bringing in foreign troops. Nevertheless, as the Johnson administration moved towards a full troop deployment to Vietnam, the push to diversify the international forces facing the communists grew stronger. During a high-level policy meeting at the White House on April 1, 1965, there was considerable dialogue about ramping up U.S. troop numbers in Vietnam. At the same time, it was agreed that exploring the deployment of Allied troops from other countries to take on combat roles should be pursued urgently. The decision was made to reach out to Australia and New Zealand for troop contributions. There was also extensive debate about bringing in troops from the Republic of Korea, which had already expressed readiness to send forces. However, the South Vietnamese showed some hesitation about Korean involvement. Still, it was decided to seek alignment and support from Saigon regarding potential contributions from other nations, including South Korea. On April 3rd, a report from General William Westmoreland, the senior U.S. commander in South Vietnam, provided further motivation to send U.S. troops and secure Allied forces. Westmoreland revealed new intelligence indicating that elements from the 325th Division of the North Vietnamese Army were operating within South Vietnam. This signified that the dynamics of the war were shifting, as South Vietnam faced an invasion from the north. The discussions and decisions stemming from the April 1st meeting were formalized on April 6th with the release of National Security Action Memorandum 328. This document tasked the State Department with investigating options to enlist combat forces from the Korean, Australian, and New Zealand governments to join the U.S. troops being deployed to South Vietnam. This initiative gained further momentum on April 15th when Washington informed Westmoreland that additional U.S. troops would be dispatched due to the worsening situation in South Vietnam. As the conflict intensified, President Johnson increasingly sought Allied support. He began to leverage every resource available to him: the SADO Treaty, diplomatic pressure, personal appeals, and the allocation of U.S. foreign aid to expand Allied involvement in South Vietnam. What began as a plea for various forms of assistance had now escalated to a demand for combat troops, moving beyond mere economic and technical support. With nearly 2 decades of Allied containment policy against communism at stake in South Vietnam, and growing international criticism of U.S. actions in Southeast Asia, it was clear that the president was keen to avoid acting unilaterally. During a conference in Honolulu on April 20, 1965, the deployment of one Australian battalion in Vung Tau and one Korean regimental combat team comprising 3 battalions in Quang Ngai was approved. These troops had previously been offered by the two nations in separate negotiations. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor was tasked with obtaining the agreement of the South Vietnamese government. In the following discussions, it was determined that the Republic of Korea would be requested to provide a division instead of a regimental combat team. In early May, General Westmoreland outlined the procedures and command relationships that would dictate how Allied forces would operate upon their arrival. The commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam would take operational control of what would be known as the Free World Military Forces. These forces would maintain their national identity, but would accept operational command from senior U.S. leaders, while the United States would offer administrative and logistical support. As Westmoreland and his team worked on the integration of Allied troops into the command framework, Australia and Korea continued their preparations, ready to deploy the troops they'd promised. Australia was the first to step up, forming a task force centered around the Royal Australian Regiment. This task force arrived in June 1965 and was placed under the operational control of the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, operating out of Bien Hoa in 3 Corps. By the end of the year, additional units like a 105mm battery, a field engineer troop, 2 signal troops, and an air reconnaissance flight increased the Australian commitment to 1,557 personnel. In May 1965, the New Zealand government decided to replace its earlier engineer detachment with a combat force. By July, a 105mm howitzer battery arrived in South Vietnam, also under the 173rd's command, to provide fire support for the Australian task force. By year's end, 119 Kiwi soldiers were present in South Vietnam. Ultimately, General Westmoreland aimed for Australia and New Zealand to deploy a full Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, brigade in the coming year. Initially, the Republic of Korea sent a task force that included an Army Engineer Battalion and support troops focused on civic action projects. This main body arrived in March 1965 and was based in Dion, Bien Hoa Province. Following the Honolulu Conference in April, the U.S. requested more South Korean forces, and in August, Seoul agreed to send an Army Infantry Division, 1 Marine Corps Regiment, and field support troops. The Iroquois Capital Infantry Division and the 2nd Marine Brigade were fully deployed by early November 1965, comprising 20,620 soldiers. These forces fell under the practical operational control of the U.S. Commanding General Field Forces Vietnam and were assigned security duties at Cam Ranh Bay and Quy Nhon. By the end of 1965, President Johnson, despite the arrival of the Anzacs and the Koreans, was still quite dissatisfied with the overall response to his repeated calls for Allied support. While several countries had made commitments, the overall reply was significantly less than Johnson had anticipated and did not contribute to the international consensus he sought to promote. As the war intensified, the call for support increasingly went unheard, and in many cases met with hostility. As the unpopularity of the war grew in foreign nations, U.S. Embassy staff found it challenging to persuade most of America's allies to get involved in the troubles occurring in South Vietnam. The fear of negative domestic and global opinions played a significant role in the decisions of several countries that Johnson sought support from. Some allies, both current and former, vocally expressed their disapproval of Johnson's escalation of the conflict and his requests for help. The French, under Charles de Gaulle, were particularly critical of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. They not only refused to lend support, but also condemned the United States for its actions in Vietnam, joining the Communists in painting the U.S. as a neo-colonial aggressor in the region. With no chance of swaying de Gaulle, Johnson turned to Great Britain. Initially, British Prime Minister Harold Wilson backed the U.S. position in South Vietnam, but as the war progressed, the British grew increasingly disenchanted with Johnson's approach. Still, Johnson desperately wanted to avoid any implication that the U.S. was engaged in a colonial war and pressed Wilson for a commitment of British troops. He even joked that he would be satisfied with just a company of bagpipers, insisting there should be around 300 to 400 British personnel in Vietnam, along with 1 or 2 aircraft squadrons. However, this did not materialize. Although Wilson remained supportive of U.S. goals, he had to contend with rising anti-war sentiment at home and did not see it as wise for Britain to become entangled in the war. Moreover, he, like many of America's European allies, was worried that the U.S. was becoming overly absorbed in Vietnam at the expense of its commitments in Europe. Wilson's own political standing soon became precarious because of his alignment with Johnson, which meant any hope for British assistance in Vietnam ultimately disappeared. Earlier, Johnson had also sought support from the Federal Republic of Germany. The Germans responded with a $40 million aid package for South Vietnam, emphasizing their full backing of U.S. policy. While this aid and public support were welcomed in Washington, the underlying reality was much more complicated. Germany was on board with the U.S. efforts to halt the spread of communism, but the situation was far from straightforward. In the context of communism in Southeast Asia, many members of the Bonn government shared concerns similar to those of the British. They worried that the United States, weakened by the war in Vietnam, might struggle to uphold its defense commitments in Europe. The issue of sending troops beyond Germany remained contentious and was restricted by the federal constitution. With minimal support from his European allies, President Johnson reignited his push for more flags among America's friends in Asia and the Pacific. Thailand had been closely observing the unfolding situation in Vietnam, understanding the risks of the conflict potentially spreading into their territory through Cambodia. They initially deployed troops to South Vietnam in 1964, sending a 16-man Royal Thai Air Force contingent. However, Johnson was dissatisfied with this level of support and urged Prime Minister Thanom Kittikachorn to increase Thailand's combat assistance to South Vietnam. It was crucial for Johnson to have more Asian nations participating in his Many Flags initiative to demonstrate to the American public that it was a genuine effort rather than just a political stunt. Furthermore, adding more troops from Thailand and other countries would alleviate General Westmoreland's escalating demands for additional U.S. forces to fight the war. By December 1965, the Thai government announced plans to send an 800-man combat battalion to South Vietnam, with over 5,000 Thai volunteers stepping forward for the mission. However, they stipulated that the United States would need to fund, equip, and supply this battalion. The U.S. agreed, and on February 17, 1966, the Royal Thai Military Assistance Group, Vietnam, was established in South Vietnam, with the Thai Air Force contingent becoming part of that group. Over the years, at the persistent requests of the U.S. government, the Thai commitment in Vietnam would expand to over 11,000 troops, costing the United States approximately $50 million each year to train, equip, and support these Thai units. The U.S. also sought troop contributions from the Philippines, and the responses, along with the associated costs, mirrored those seen with the Thai forces. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who consented to send a 1,500-man engineer unit to South Vietnam, was driven by similar motivations. The United States offered financial aid to support the Philippine efforts as well as concerns for Vietnam. In exchange for sending troops, the U.S. Military Assistance Program not only covered the costs for the Philippine forces, but also provided President Marcos with various types of military aid, much of which was intended for use within the Philippines rather than in Vietnam. By mid-October 1966, the first Philippine Civic Action Group had been established, comprising 2,000 personnel at a base camp near Tainan City. This group included an engineer construction battalion, medical and rural community development teams, a security battalion, a field artillery battery, and logistical and headquarters support. The expenses for the Philippine force would amount to $39 million for the U.S. from 1967 to 1969. As attempts to enlist more nations yielded little success, the Johnson administration shifted its focus to urging current allies in Vietnam to enhance their involvement. With Washington's encouragement, Australia increased its commitment from 1 battalion to 2, along with various support and aviation units. Additional troop deployments and the arrival of C-130 Hercules transport planes boosted the Australian presence to over 8,000 troops in South Vietnam by October 1967. Similarly, New Zealand responded to American requests by raising its contribution to about 1,000 combat and artillery support troops. Unlike Thailand and the Philippines, both Australia and New Zealand covered the costs associated with their military presence in Vietnam themselves. These nations were notably worried that a communist victory in Vietnam could spill over into the rest of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. New Zealand's Prime Minister Keith Holyoake remarked that South Vietnam served as a test case in Asia, suggesting that if communists succeeded there, they would likely expand their efforts into Thailand, Malaysia, and beyond, posing a closer threat to Australia and New Zealand. The Australian leadership shared Holyoake's concerns, and despite increasing domestic discontent with the war, both Australia and New Zealand sustained a robust presence in South Vietnam until the conclusion of the American involvement in the conflict. The Johnson administration also persuaded South Korea to bolster its commitment, ultimately increasing the number of Korean troops to nearly 50,000. This was a significant commitment given Korea's own strategic interests. South Korea, which had successfully defended against communist threats with help from the international community, saw its president Chung-hee Park declare that participating in South Vietnam would not only enhance his nation's security, but also bolster the anti-communist stance of the free world. However, Park's claim wasn't entirely selfless. The financial burden of South Korea's involvement in the war was largely covered by the United States, totaling $1 billion from 1965 to 1970. On top of that, the U.S. provided South Korea with $150 million in development loans and $600 million in military contract profits, services, and construction projects. While President Johnson continued to seek broader international support for the conflict, his choice to bomb North Vietnam in June 1966 effectively dashed hopes of expanding the Allied coalition. The peak of military buildup occurred in fiscal year 1966, after which a decline began, with the number of free world military forces gradually decreasing as the war progressed. When Richard Nixon took office and started reducing U.S. troop levels, other nations involved in the coalition also began withdrawing their forces from South Vietnam. Throughout the conflict, thousands of troops from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines fought alongside American and South Vietnamese soldiers. Free world military forces suffered a total of 5,241 casualties in Vietnam, with 4,407 being Korean and 475 from Australia and New Zealand. There's no doubt these forces played a role in the overall Allied efforts, yet Lyndon Johnson's vision of a unified international backing for U.S. involvement in South Vietnam never came to fruition, despite significant attempts to achieve it. The global reaction to the ongoing U.S. presence in Vietnam, rising anti-war sentiment worldwide, and the uncertainty from Saigon hindered Johnson's aspirations. Ultimately, the war remained America's struggle. Operation Junction City was an extensive 2.5-month campaign in War Zone C, aimed at clearing the region to eliminate a significant enemy stronghold. The operation sought to locate and engage the enemy, with the goal of defeating them to allow for further pacification efforts in the area. Junction City serves as a prime example of force generation and the strategic shaping of operations to impact the battlefield. Yet, it also highlighted the challenges of conducting counterinsurgency against an enemy that comprised both guerrilla fighters and regular troops, all of whom had easy access to sanctuary across the borders. Ultimately, the operation yielded noteworthy outcomes in terms of enemy casualties and the capture or destruction of equipment and supplies. General Bernard W. Rogers, the Assistant Division Commander for the 1st Infantry Division, described Junction City as a turning point in the conflict. However, despite its tactical successes, the operation resembled a mere step in what General Dave Palmer referred to as an escalating military stalemate. The enemy remained elusive, making it tough to locate, fix, and neutralize them. The operation commenced on February 22, 1967, aiming to locate and dismantle the Central Office for South Vietnam headquarters and weaken the 9th Viet Cong Division. Managed by the two field forces, Vietnam, approximately 35,000 troops were deployed throughout different phases of this significant operation, which, at its launch, was the largest of the conflict up to that time. U.S. ground combat involvement in Vietnam began in March 1965 with the landing of the 9th Marines at Da Nang. They were soon followed by troops from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 1st Infantry Division, the 101st Airborne Division, and the 1st Cavalry Division. By the close of 1965, more than 184,000 U.S. ground troops were stationed in Vietnam. The year 1966 saw rapid buildup and marked the onset of major offensive operations by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. By 1967, the aim of U.S. combat operations shifted to locating and destroying Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam forces in the field, adopting a strategy of attrition. General William C. Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, faced policy restrictions that limited his ability to target enemy sanctuaries in Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam. He was constrained to mounting a strategic defense within Allied borders. Westmoreland believed he could only prevail by making the war so burdensome that Hanoi would withdraw its troops and cease efforts to unify Vietnam under communist rule. Focused on safeguarding and calming population centers, U.S. and Allied forces aimed to confront communist factions in the less populated regions close to the western borders with Cambodia and Laos, as well as in other insurgent strongholds across the south. These missions typically took the shape of search and destroy operations, carried out away from heavy population areas and in zones where enemy forces were concentrated. They involved intense assaults by infantry and armored units, utilized Allied air mobility, and used heavy supporting fire to locate, engage, and eliminate the enemy and their strongholds. As the number of Army combat troops in Vietnam increased, General Westmoreland set up two corps-level commands under Mac V. The I Field Force, Vietnam, was tasked with overseeing the Toot Corps Tactical Zone, which encompassed the Central Highlands, while the Toot Field Force, Vietnam, managed the 3 Corps Tactical Zone, an area bordered by the Central Highlands to the north and the Mekong Delta to the south. The field force commanders reported directly to the Mac V commander, serving as the top Army tactical leaders in their designated regions. In March 1966, Lieutenant Gen. Jonathan O. Seaman took command of the Seat Field Force Vietnam. A graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1934, Seaman had served during World War II in both the European and Pacific theaters. Stationed at Long Binh, the 2 Field Force Vietnam was activated on March 15, 1966, becoming the largest corps-level command in Vietnam and one of the largest in Army history. As the commander of IFV, Lieutenant Seaman had responsibility for U.S. forces in the 3 Corps Tactical Zone, which included the 11 provinces surrounding Saigon. His area also contained significant Viet Cong base areas to the northeast and northwest of Saigon, such as War Zones C and D, the Iron Triangle, and the Boi Loi Woods. Furthermore, he was responsible for protecting the main enemy routes from Cambodia that directly posed a threat to Saigon, the capital of the Republic of Vietnam. Lieutenant General Seaman was well acquainted with the region, having previously led the 1st Infantry Division, which had been operating in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone since it arrived in Vietnam in July 1965. By this stage in the conflict, U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were facing a mixed threat. They had to tackle an insurgency supported from the outside, but they also had to confront the main force VC and North Vietnamese troops in a more traditional manner. Following MAT V priorities, Lieutenant General Seaman directed his focus toward the latter, leaving the insurgency and pacification efforts in his operational area to the ARVN and South Vietnamese militia, who were more suited to spread Saigon's influence among their own communities. Seaman was primarily worried about the threat posed by the main force VC and North Vietnamese units, which operated from sanctuaries in Cambodia and other previously identified base areas. He had a strong military presence at his command, yet the vastness of his responsibilities was a concern. Instead of adopting a defensive strategy and waiting for the enemy to approach, he aimed to confront the enemy on their home turf. However, as he learned during his command of the Big Red One, taking the fight to the enemy was challenging unless it was on their terms. With restrictions against entering Cambodia, success against the main enemy forces hinged on isolating them in their base areas within Vietnam and preventing their retreat to Cambodia once combat began. The sheer size of the operational area and its closeness to the border made this a persistent issue. In May 1966, keeping these obstacles in mind, Lieutenant General Seaman instructed his team to plan an operation to clear War Zone C and remove it as a base for enemy activities. Ideally, this operation would facilitate follow-on pacification efforts aimed at diminishing the Viet Cong's residual presence in the area. This operation, designated Junction City, was set to begin in January 1967. While EFV was preparing for this mission, Lieutenant General Seaman also tasked his staff to plan a similar operation in the Iron Triangle, another critical enemy stronghold viewed as a dagger pointed at the heart of Saigon. This operation was named Cedar Falls. For both operations, Seaman aimed to locate, engage, and eliminate the enemy forces in the zone before they could flee to sanctuaries in Cambodia. As planning progressed for both missions, intelligence reports revealed a significant buildup in the Iron Triangle area. Lieutenant General Seaman was increasingly alarmed by this growing threat since it was situated closer to Saigon. The objective area for Junction City was significant. A buildup in the Iron Triangle could suggest an impending attack on the capital. In light of this, he advised Westmoreland to delay Junction City in favor of Cedar Falls. This approach would relieve any immediate danger to Saigon and make an additional division available for Junction City, as the 9th Infantry Division was en route and would be assigned to IIFV upon its arrival. Westmoreland concurred with Seaman's suggestion. Cedar Falls would proceed first, followed by an immediate attack into War Zone C after its completion. The Iron Triangle was a 300 square kilometer area located about 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon, which included the Than Dien Forestry Reserve. It had been a crucial staging ground for the Viet Cong since the war's early days. Lieutenant General Seaman outlined the Cedar Falls mission as the destruction of enemy forces, facilities, and infrastructure within that zone. The operation specifically aimed at the VC Military Region 4 headquarters and the 272nd VC Regiment. Seaman intended to eliminate the Iron Triangle's role as a sanctuary and base for enemy operations. This would involve not just a direct assault on the VC in the area, but also relocating the civilian population and demolishing their homes to cut off support for the VC there. Once the civilians were evacuated, the region would be declared a specified strike zone, meaning anyone left would be deemed an enemy combatant. Operation Cedar Falls commenced on January 8, 1967. It involved 2 Army divisions, 1 light infantry, and 1 paratroop brigade, along with an armored cavalry regiment, plus several South Vietnamese Army battalions, totaling 30,000 troops from the U.S. and South Vietnam. The plan outlined a hammer and anvil operation where part of the Allied forces would take blocking positions as the anvil, while the remainder would be deployed throughout the operation area to push the enemy into these established blocks. Concurrently, U.S. troops would encircle the area to prevent enemy escape. However, during the operation, the enemy proved to be quite elusive, fleeing into Cambodia or hiding within a complex tunnel system that ran throughout the region. During the operation, which concluded on January 26, 1967, there were no large-scale battles, but Allied troops engaged in a series of smaller skirmishes and discovered various enemy supply caches. Simultaneously, engineers were busy clearing the jungle, using chemicals to defoliate certain areas to prevent the enemy from having a sanctuary near Saigon. During this operation, the 5,987 residents of the village of Ben Suc, known for their support of the Viet Cong, were relocated and the village itself was destroyed. The outcome of Cedar Falls was significant, resulting in 750 confirmed enemy soldiers killed and 213 captured. A considerable amount of weapons, ammunition, rations, and other supplies was either captured or destroyed. On the U.S. side, losses included 72 soldiers killed in action and 337 wounded in action. From the viewpoints of Seaman and Westmoreland, Cedar Falls was seen as a major success. Seaman remarked that the operation demonstrated the benefits of extended actions within areas controlled by the Viet Cong, indicating that the enemy would need to reassess their capabilities compared to those of the Allies. However, the assertion that the Iron Triangle is no more proved to be greatly exaggerated. In reality, once U.S. and South Vietnamese forces withdrew, the Viet Cong quickly returned to their base areas. Moreover, Cedar Falls turned into a public relations debacle due to critical reports about the forced evacuation of Ben Suc's residents and the subsequent destruction of their village. Nevertheless, Generals Westmoreland and Seaman viewed Cedar Falls as a positive move and sought to maintain the momentum by launching Operation Junction City. The operation targeted War Zone C, a flat, marshy area measuring 50 by 30 miles along the Cambodian border, about 45 miles northwest of Saigon. This area, covering 1,000 square miles, was bounded to the north and west by the Cambodian border, with its eastern edge running parallel to Highway 13. It spanned parts of Tay Ninh, Bin Long, and Bin Duong provinces. MAT VFV were particularly concerned about this area because it lay between Saigon and the Cambodian border and had long been a vital launch point for enemy forces and supplies infiltrating from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Additionally, War Zone C served as the regular operating ground for the 9th VC Division, one of the enemy's most effective units. The area was believed to house the central office for South Vietnam, the primary headquarters for all enemy operations in the southern region. The goal of Junction City was to penetrate deep into War Zone C to locate and eliminate COSVN, while also targeting the 9th VC Division and the 101st NVA Regiment, both thought to be in the vicinity. Additionally, any enemy bases and facilities in the operation zone were to be dismantled. Ultimately, Lieutenant General Seaman aimed to not only weaken enemy forces, but also to provide a foundation for revolutionary development in subsequent pacification efforts. As part of the operation, IIFV was tasked with setting up a Special Forces Civilian Irregular Defense Group camp and airfield at Prek Klok. The plan was to cordon off the target area with friendly forces, allowing additional Allied troops to move in and eliminate enemy forces, supply depots, and base camps trapped within the perimeter. Planning for Junction City was intricate due to the vast operational area and the number of units involved. A significant challenge for Lieutenant General Seaman and his team was finding a way to rapidly assemble maximum combat power on the ground. If they couldn't muster enough force quickly, the enemy could easily evade combat and retreat to safe havens across the border in Cambodia, just as they had during Cedar Falls. To carry out this operation, EIFV deployed 35,000 Allied troops, including elements from the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, a brigade from the 4th Infantry Division, and several ARVN units. While these divisions and brigades had organic units available, other mission commitments meant that some units were unable to participate. Consequently, the initial task organization for the operation included the following: 1st Infantry Division, 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, 173rd Airborne Brigade, TF Wallace ARVN, 25th Infantry Division, 2nd Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, 196th Light Infantry Brigade, 11th ACR. For this operation, TF Alpha had a total of 22 maneuver battalions, 14 artillery battalions, and 3 ARVN battalions at its disposal. This setup allowed for effective task force operations, where combined arms actions at both battalion and squadron levels became routine. Given the large scale of the operation, IHO-FFV needed to manage a significant troop and logistical buildup without revealing their plans too soon. Consequently, the operations planning was carried out under stringent security measures. As combat forces readied for engagement, Lieutenant General Seaman initiated 2 deception operations to mask the movement of troops and supplies around War Zone C. Operation Gadsden, led by the 25th Infantry Division, was executed along the Cambodian border in the far west of the area, while Operation TUSN was carried out by the 1st Infantry Division to the east of the Michelin rubber plantation. Lieutenant General Seaman aimed for these shaping operations to achieve two goals: to position the blocking forces to the west and east, and to encourage the 9th VC Division to relocate its 271st and 272nd Regiments into the targeted area ahead of the operation. The Junction City planners developed a two-phased operation that utilized the same hammer and anvil strategy used in Operation Cedar Falls, but on a much larger scale. The plan outlined 5 U.S. brigades, creating a large, inverted, horseshoe-shaped cordon with blocking positions in the western half of War Zone C. Once established, other forces would advance northward to push the enemy into these blocking positions. The 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division, and the 196th Light Infantry Brigade were tasked to hold blocking positions in the west along the Cambodian border, approximately 4 to 5 miles east of Highways 22 and 246. In the north, the 1st Infantry Division would establish a blocking line along Highway 4. The 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division would secure the eastern boundary. Following this, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment on the right and the 2nd Brigade, 25th Infantry Division on the left would push in from the south into the large inverted horseshoe. The objective was to force the enemy into U.S. blocking positions where they could be decisively engaged. Almost 250 helicopters were necessary to transport the 8 infantry battalions of the 1st Infantry Division, prompting the 3 battalions from the 173rd Airborne Brigade to execute a combat parachute jump into their designated blocking positions. Lieutenant General Seaman aimed to deploy the largest number of troops on the ground within the shortest time frame, hoping to prevent COSVN and the 9th VC Division from escaping the area. The operation demanded precise timing and careful movement to muster the needed combat strength and secure the cordon. Fire support would come from 17 artillery battalions and more than 4,000 close air support missions, with airspace coordination over the target area being a significant concern. Junction City kicked off at 7 a.m. on February 22nd with the parachute drop by the 173rd Airborne Brigade. About 840 paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, boarded 16 C-130 aircraft at Bien Hoa and leaped into drop zones in northern Tay Ninh Province, near Khartoum, just 7 miles from Cambodia. This unopposed parachute landing marked the only major U.S. combat jump of the war. Meanwhile, 249 helicopters participated in the largest single-day air-mobile operation in Army aviation history, inserting 8 infantry battalions into the northern blocking positions. Lieutenant General Seaman hoped that deploying so many forces at once would catch the enemy off guard, but the level of surprise was difficult to gauge. There was minimal contact at first. The next day, Southern forces along Highway 247 began their advance north into the Horseshoe. The 2nd Brigade, 25th Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment encountered only light resistance, though some tanks and armored personnel carriers sustained damage from mines and RPG fire. Both units uncovered substantial caches of enemy supplies and equipment, along with numerous fortifications and base camps. Simultaneously, units patrolling the outer edges of the Horseshoe found enemy base locations while monitoring their blocking positions. Enemy contact remained light, with reports indicating small squad-sized forces or smaller. On February 24th, 1967, Lieutenant General Seaman relayed instructions to the commanding generals of the 1st and 25th Divisions, directing them to conduct a comprehensive search of Western War Zone C. The 2nd Brigade, 25th Division, and the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment were also instructed to continue their operations. They continued their advance northward into the designated positions. The attackers kept running into enemy base camps and supply caches. They seized or destroyed considerable amounts of weapons, ammunition, rice, and various other supplies. On February 28th, elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade uncovered the VC's Central Information Office, which included an underground photo lab equipped with film. Shortly after, a company from the 173rd engaged with an enemy company to the east of Chatham. This led to a fierce confrontation with heavy casualties on both sides. 20 U.S. paratroopers were killed and 28 were wounded, while the VC lost 39 men. That same day, a company from the 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry, encountered a well-concealed enemy force near the Prek River. After pinning down the lead platoon with intense fire, the VC launched a ground assault that overwhelmed the American unit, resulting in nearly every soldier being killed or wounded. The VC then focused on the rest of the company, triggering a bitter firefight. Close air support was requested, and reinforcements were dispatched to assist the beleaguered unit. 2 companies were inserted by helicopter after several airstrikes, which finally forced the enemy to disengage. When the reinforcements reached the company, they found it had suffered nearly 50% casualties. They all moved to a landing zone for the night. The next morning's battlefield inspection revealed 144 enemy dead and 40 captured weapons. U.S. casualties for this confrontation were also significant, with 25 killed and 28 wounded. An intelligence assessment later suggested that the 1st Company had likely walked into an enemy staging area prepared for an attack on convoy operations along Route 4. Over the following 10 days, there were many daily skirmishes within the Junction City operational area, though most were at the platoon level or smaller. Lieutenant General Seaman had hoped to locate and engage larger enemy forces, but for the most part, enemy battalions managed to avoid contact. Throughout this operation, Allied forces uncovered numerous major base camps and seized vast amounts of enemy equipment and supplies. At this juncture, Lieutenant General Seaman chose to withdraw from his northern positions along the Cambodian border. His aim was to broaden the search for the main enemy formations, which had thus far proven to be quite elusive. In March, Seaman ordered the 1st Infantry Division to launch an offensive against what was believed to be the 101st Regiment and possibly SUFVN's intelligence base, located southeast of Chatham and east of Route 4. Simultaneously, he instructed the 25th Infantry Division to deploy at least half its troops into an area called the Elephant's Ear, west of Highway 22, where reports suggested that the 271st VC Regiment was situated. On March 10th, the 272nd VC Regiment attacked the 168th Engineer Battalion, which was busy constructing a Special Forces base camp near Prek. The engineers were protected by the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Infantry, and the 2nd Battalion, 33rd Artillery. The enemy's decision to engage such significant forces against an American position might have been influenced by the entrapment of a segment of COSVN during a pincer maneuver along the Cambodian border. A captured soldier later revealed that the assault was a diversion aimed at diverting Allied troops that were reportedly threatening COSVN's military staff. The attack commenced at 10:08 p.m. with a fierce barrage from 60, 82, and 120 mm mortars. Once the bombardment ceased, 2 VC battalions launched an assault on the infantry from the east and southwest. Simultaneously, the VC initiated a secondary attack on Artillery Base 1. Thanks to effective close air support, the infantry successfully held their ground against the main VC assault, while the artillery, firing howitzers at point-blank range, ultimately repelled the attackers. The following morning, 197 enemy combatants were counted as killed in action on the battlefield. On March 18th, Junction City transitioned into Phase 2, which aimed to clear the eastern sector of War Zone C. For this phase, Lieutenant General Seaman and 2 FFV took control of the 1st Brigade, 9th Infantry Division, and the 1st Brigade, 1st Infantry Division. Initially, the 173rd Airborne Brigade was not included in Phase 2, but at the request of the 1st Infantry Division commander, it was retained and attached to the Big Red One. Concurrently, the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division handed over security responsibilities for Preklok SF Camp and its vicinity to the 196th Light Infantry Brigade and left the operation for another mission focused on revolutionary development elsewhere. Throughout Phase 1, U.S. forces had thoroughly searched the area within the Horseshoe. 835 VC and NVA were reported killed, 15 taken prisoner, and 264 individual and crew-served weapons seized, along with vast amounts of supplies and equipment. Seamen felt let down that Phase 1 hadn't yielded more significant results and that COSVN remained elusive. With the western part of Warzone C cleared in Phase 1, the plan for Phase 2 involved conducting search and destroy missions in the eastern section. Lieutenant General Seaman aimed to maintain coordination of the operation, but would allow the commanders of the 1st and 25th Divisions to operate independently within their assigned areas. This flexibility was intended to help them respond effectively to evolving situations in their zones of responsibility. This strategy led to several fierce encounters. On the night of March 19th, a troop from the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry of the 9th Infantry Division, was attacked at their defensive position in Bao Bang by the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 273rd VC Regiment. In the heat of the battle, the cavalrymen secured themselves inside their armored personnel carriers, while artillery within the perimeter unleashed anti-personnel beehive rounds to fend off the assailants. As they held their ground, troops B and C of the 5th Cavalry fought their way into the besieged perimeter to assist their comrades. Throughout the night, the U.S. Air Force conducted 87 close air support missions under illumination to drive back the attackers. Ultimately, the combined firepower from armored cavalry, supporting artillery, and close air support forced the enemy to retreat. The battle resulted in 227 enemy killed, while U.S. casualties included 3 killed and 63 wounded. In the early hours of March 21st, at Fire Support Base Gold near Suoi Tre, the 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery, and the 3rd Battalion, 22nd Infantry from the 3rd Brigade, 4th Division, faced a heavy assault from 2 communist regiments, the 273rd from the 9th VC Division and the PVVN 16th Regiment, also known as the 70th Guards Regiment. Beneath the cover of a relentless mortar barrage, around 2,500 enemy troops launched an attack, breaking through FSB Gold's defensive line. These human wave assaults were accompanied by a tremendous volume of RPG rockets, recoilless rifle shells, and automatic gunfire. The hand-to-hand combat was fierce, but the defenders held firm, bolstered by effective close air support targeting the VC. At one point, artillery units fired beehive rounds straight at the enemy, yet the attackers pressed on. As the battle continued, the 2nd Battalion of the 12th Infantry fought through to FSB Gold to support the weary defenders. The fighting carried on into daylight, and FSB Gold was eventually relieved by units from the 2nd Battalion of the 34th Armor. This 70-vehicle tank and mechanized infantry column utterly dismantled organized enemy resistance, causing the remaining attackers to flee into the jungle. General Hong Kam, commander of the 9th VC Division, later admitted his forces had incurred heavy losses during the battle at Suoi Tre. Tragically, the defenders also suffered. 31 Americans perished, and 187 were wounded. On March 24th, Lieutenant General Seaman was succeeded by Lieutenant Gen. Bruce Palmer, Jr. as the commanding general of Suit Field Force, Vietnam. Palmer, acting on his staff's recommendations, concluded that the search in southeastern Warzone C had reached its limit and was about to order the cessation of operations in that area when new intelligence indicated that the 271st Regiment was moving through toward Kadam. Consequently, Palmer directed the 196th Light Infantry Brigade to head north and intercept them. However, the VC Regiment was advancing so quickly that when the 196th arrived at Kadam, the enemy had already passed through toward the east. The 271st Regiment would later be part of the last major clash of Junction City, which occurred near Ap Gu at Landing Zone, LZ George, situated 23 miles north of Dao Tieng and just 3 miles from the Cambodian border. The 1st Battalion of the 26th Infantry, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander M. Haig, occupied LZ George on March 26. 5 days later, Company B was advancing east from the LZ when it came under heavy fire and found itself pinned down. Haig then sent in his A Company to support B Company. Both units managed to fall back to the defensive perimeter near the LZ, which had been reinforced by elements of the 1st Battalion of the 16th Infantry. In the early hours of April 1st, the 271st VC Regiment and the 1st VC Battalion of the 70th Guards launched a significant attack. On a section of the perimeter defended by C Company, the enemy managed to breach through, but American forces pushed them back. Eventually, a combination of artillery, helicopter gunships, and close air support drove the attackers away. In this conflict, the U.S. faced 17 soldiers killed in action, while 600 enemy combatants were reported dead. Initially, Operation Junction City was planned to be completed in 2 phases. However, General Palmer, eager to capitalize on the successes at Suoi Tre and Ap Gu, opted to add a Phase 3, which began on April 15th. A brigade task force that included a mechanized battalion from the 25th Infantry Division and an ARVN battalion conducted ongoing sweeps through Warzone C in search of enemy forces. Simultaneously, the 996th Light Infantry Brigade was reassigned from IHU-FV and moved north to the I-Corps Tactical Zone. Units from the 9th Infantry Division briefly occupied the area left behind by the 996th. Unfortunately, the Phase 3 sweeps yielded minimal results. With little enemy contact during this phase, focus shifted toward improving and clearing roads, constructing bridges, and establishing the Prek Clock SF camp. On May 4, 1967, General Palmer brought Operation Junction City to a close. From a tactical viewpoint, the operation was deemed successful. Communist propaganda claimed that it had resulted in over 14,000 U.S. and ARVN casualties, along with 800 armored vehicles destroyed and 119 artillery pieces captured. In reality, the numbers were much lower: 218 killed and 1,176 wounded. Additionally, the losses included 3 tanks, 4 helicopters, 5 howitzers, and 21 armored personnel carriers. UFV reported 2,728 enemy soldiers killed, with an unknown number wounded. The Allied forces also confiscated 490 weapons, 850 tons of supplies, 500,000 pages of documents, and destroyed more than 5,000 bunkers and military structures. When Operation Junction City was concluded on May 14, 1967, it set a record as the most successful operation in terms of confirmed enemy losses up to that point. MACV and 2FV stated that all major objectives were met, except for locating and dismantling COSVN. Even though the top enemy headquarters wasn't eliminated, there was a consensus that a significant turning point had been reached. However, looking back, Junction City ultimately did not provide any long-term strategic advantage. In the end, the enemy managed to slip across the border into safe havens in Cambodia. The multiple attacks along the edges of the horseshoe caught them by surprise tactically, but by the time D-Day concluded, the enemy understood the strategy behind the cordon and swiftly dispersed. One account noted that it was nearly impossible to prevent the enemy from escaping whenever they chose, as the jungle was simply too dense and expansive. There were intense skirmishes on the outskirts of the horseshoe, where Allied forces dealt heavy blows to the enemy at Suoi Tre and Ap Gu. Despite the destruction of several VC units, the majority of the enemy, including the elusive COSVN headquarters, managed to escape to fight another day. General John Hay, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, pointed out several reasons for this outcome, including the closeness of a privileged sanctuary, the significant challenge in establishing a seal that was dense enough to deny infiltration routes, and the difficulty in achieving total surprise due to extensive troop and logistical repositioning before D-Day. While Junction City was underway, the Communists had effectively lost Warzone C as a viable base and staging area, yet 2 field force could not stop enemy forces from escaping the trap officials had envisioned. Brigadier General Rogers, the assistant division commander of the 1st Infantry Division, highlighted a more enduring flaw of the operation. He remarked that a discouraging aspect of both Cedar Falls and Junction City was the lack of sufficient troops, whether American or South Vietnamese, to maintain operations in the Iron Triangle and Warzone C, thus allowing the Viet Cong to return. As historian Gregory Daddis notes, Junction City was meant to create a shield for revolutionary development, but there was no plan for American units to remain to execute that strategy. Therefore, Warzone C was far from neutralized. Although 3 enemy regiments were significantly weakened in the combat, those losses proved to be temporary, and they returned in force less than a year later. Nonetheless, Junction City demonstrated that the primary VC operating in supply bases in South Vietnam could be vulnerable to superior U.S. firepower and mobility. As a result, the Communists relocated their headquarters into Cambodia. With the White House not approving large-scale operations across the border, American planners had no choice but to adopt a defensive strategy aimed at wearing down the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces through attrition. While significant operations like Cedar Falls and Junction City managed to keep enemy main force units at bay in their remote base areas, those operations left the densely populated regions for the ARVN to manage. Westmoreland couldn't afford to keep substantial forces away from their bases for extended periods without jeopardizing their security. When U.S. forces withdrew from the more remote regions, the enemy quickly reclaimed their base areas and resumed operations. The Integrated Infantry Brigade, similar to its counterpart in the Central Highlands, didn't have enough troops to protect both its base and populated regions while maintaining sufficient combat power to push the enemy out. This meant they couldn't permanently deny those areas to the enemy. Just 10 days after Junction City, War Zone C was reportedly crawling with what appeared to be Viet Cong. Although the 3 regiments of the 9th VC Division were deemed combat ineffective at the operation's end, the enemy continuously showed their ability to replenish their losses. Operation Junction City highlights the challenges of managing situations involving both insurgents and conventional enemy forces during counterinsurgency efforts. The goal is to clear, hold, and build, but often there's merely enough power to clear an area without the capacity to maintain control. This situation becomes even more complicated due to protected sanctuaries across an international border that friendly forces cannot cross to pursue the enemy. Consequently, regions like the Iron Triangle and War Zone C remained strongholds for the enemy, fiercely contested from Cedar Falls and Junction City all the way to the end of the conflict in 1975. Operations like Junction City were notable in size and scope, but they yielded no enduring strategic advantage. Brown noted that as long as the Communists had the resources and determination to engage in this one-sided battle, it would persist. Ultimately, it led to a brutal stalemate, with casualties rising on both sides.